Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Intel update for February 7th through the 14th, 2026. It's been kind of a quiet week by comparison, I guess. Only a few major terror attacks to be aware of, so basically everything is fairly standard for this week. But anyway, we've got a lot to talk about, so let's get right to it. Around the world this week, things have been pretty busy on multiple fronts, but nothing entirely new. Here in the homeland, the civil unrest that flared up in Minneapolis and other major cities has simmered down for a couple of weeks now, although some cities have been host to an increased baseline of violence. Overseas, several investigations have been initiated in conjunction with the Epstein document releases, and civil unrest appears to be popping off in some major cities in France due to recent clashes between protesters and activist groups. In the UK, stabbing attacks continue as before, with about 3 or 4 stabbings being reported in London more or less every day. Same story in France and Italy, whereby civil unrest and domestic terrorism has bloomed into season a bit earlier this year. As the Olympics are ongoing in Italy, many different terrorist cells have been sabotaging rail lines in a few different cities. And in France, French nationalists are fighting French anarchists in a few major cities after protests have become intense riots over the past few days. Otherwise, in the Middle East, the situation is heating up yet again, and the US is starting to dump military resources into the region once more. Timeline-wise, we're looking at a couple of weeks before any potential happening is on the menu. Unless the Pentagon just wants to bomb a few targets like they did last time and make me look like an idiot, both of which are always likely. Keeping track of airframes and ships is basically a full-time job for a whole team of people, but at a very wave-top level, the US has been observably pumping more resources into the region at a steady pace over the past few weeks. So overall, a lot of things to keep on the lookout for over the next few weeks. Switching things up a little bit, let's move to Western Europe before we get into the actual homeland for this week, and let's talk about some developing incidents that are going on right now throughout France. The spotlight has been on France and the headlines over the past few days due to a couple of different incidents which have recently garnered a lot of attention. The first incident is the stabbing attack that took place yesterday at the Arc de Triomphe, by which a known and convicted terrorist conducted another police stabbing, wounding one soldier at the flame lighting ceremony for their Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. This is a fairly standard ceremony, I think. I'm pretty sure they do it every day at 6:30, but either way, they end up, rekindling the flame at their Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and there's usually a small crowd, or either of tourists or people who, want to pay their respects and things like that. And last night, an assailant tried to stab everybody at this event, so the attacker has been identified as Brahim Barir, who was also tried, convicted, and imprisoned for doing the exact same thing in Brussels back in 2012, so he used to be a pretty high-ranking member of a lot of different extremist cells throughout Paris and was kind of a figurehead for a lot of things. Maybe not so much a public figurehead, but he was very heavily involved in a lot of extremist groups and things like that in Paris over the past, decade or so. Back in 2012, he actually traveled from Paris, where he was known to be an extremist, to Brussels, specifically to target police officers, which he did. So he got caught, tried, and convicted for that, and at some point he was either let out or just mysteriously appeared back in civil society once again and conducted the stabbing attack again last night. So not entirely a great look, especially considering the hard times that seem to have fallen upon Paris over the past few years, but down south in France, a much more serious situation is underway, which has involved a lot of civil unrest. So in the town of Lyon, Antifa has gotten quite a bit upset over the past few days after anti-immigration activists in the south of France have started to kind of voice their opinion a little bit more, and that's just made Antifa quite a bit upset, and a lot of these French anarchist groups upset. They have the same kind of cellular arrangement that we have here in the US when it comes to our far-left extremists. They've got the same thing in France, except their guys are a lot more violent in this case, so they actually beat a man to death, one of the security guards, or an activist who was serving in a security role for a French feminist movement group was trying to conduct a protest, and you know how in the US we have a lot of protests and counter-protests. Well, the same thing in France. So a few days ago, or a couple of days ago, one of the French feminist groups who is more along the lines of stopping violence against women from the immigrants, that's kind of the way that these groups are starting to form. One of these groups was mobbed by Antifa, and it turns out one of the guys that they had gotten to help protect them, one of those guys got beaten pretty severely, and unfortunately he passed away last night. So as a response to this, the French nationalists have come out, and a lot of nationalist groups have come out to oppose Antifa, and suffice it to say, things are going to get pretty spicy over the next few days. So we'll be watching this pretty closely, simply because there are a lot of parallels between France and the United States, and of course, France is Europe, right? It's Western civilization, right? So they share a lot of the same societal goals that we do. Even though our cultures are very different, it's still the same thing. It's all Western Europe and the United States. So we're all in the same slop bucket together, so a lot of times we have the same adversaries and the same enemies, and that is certainly the case in France, the UK, Germany, wherever you want to name it. So keeping an eye on these things is going to be important over the next few weeks. Similar story throughout Western Europe in terms of the Epstein files. So while many here in the United States may be lamenting the fact that nobody's really been arrested kind of at all with regards to the names that have come out of the Epstein files, in Europe they actually have been doing something. Now I think many Europeans, like many Americans, don't exactly have a whole lot of faith in their judicial systems, but at least they've done something. So Norway has actually launched a criminal investigation, and I think they actually dropped criminal charges on a former prime minister of Norway for his association with Epstein, but the crimes that they're trying to prosecute are all corruption based, so they're not like human trafficking based. So that's kind of how Europe is handling it right now, and so far they've got 3 major diplomats in Norway which are implicated and are being investigated. So at least they can say that they're investigating their guys. Now they probably won't be arrested or anything, but I don't know. Who knows? Hard to say. There are grumblings and rumors of the same thing, same kinds of investigative processes being undertaken in France and also in Slovakia. Again, hard to say how all this is going to work out, but I wanted to mention it anyway because a lot of people here in the U.S. are saying, nobody's been arrested, nobody's even been questioned or interviewed, whereas in Europe, they actually kind of are. So that's kind of interesting, but again, the bar could not be any lower when it comes to getting some sort of accountability or justice for the whole Epstein thing, but we'll get into that in just a moment. Here in the homeland for this week, the big flare-ups have died down a bit, but the violence has continued as far-left activists continue to figure out that terrorism actually works. Ever since ICE pulled out of Minneapolis, or technically reduced their posture there, far-left activist groups have perceived this to be a victory, especially since the FBI has basically ignored all of the terrorist groups which have been running rampant in Minneapolis for years. So as of right now, the mood among many far-left groups is that of sheer unchallenged victory. They certainly think that they have won by kicking ICE out of their city. Now, is that entirely true? Probably not, but that's up for you to decide. It's certainly complicated. What is very clear is that the inaction of the feds, not just ICE, but say like other law enforcement groups which are in charge of maybe, counterterrorism. In many cases, this inaction has encouraged far-left groups to think that violence, arson, vehicle ramming attacks, and terrorism in general is an acceptable line of effort to achieve their goals. Even though it certainly is not, they certainly think it is. Thus, the middle-aged women who should be picking up their kids from school rather than trying to firebomb empty buildings without even trying to conceal their identity. So we've got that going for us at least. Otherwise, the situation remains pretty much the same as before nationwide. Locals in Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. have reported that the stench in the air has become palpable, and there's also a major sewage leak as well. Almost a month after roughly 1 billion gallons of raw sewage was dumped into the Potomac, locals have been advised to avoid all contact with the Potomac. Unless you're from Mumbai, then you should be alright. But for the rest of us, the levels of E. coli are a few thousand times the safe limits, and if you've been fishing or boating in the river over the past month, you probably have some kind of giga turbo AIDS by now. Which is interesting because when this spill was first announced, the local water utility claimed that the levels of E. coli were at safe levels. But it turns out they messed up the decimal point, because of course they did, and it was actually 100 times what they initially reported, which is slightly suboptimal news for anyone living in Northern Virginia or Maryland who has been in or around the river over the past month. And speaking of foul toxins from whence there is no escape, the Epstein file situation continues to grow more and more as investigations start putting pieces together. Right now it's been pretty hectic as there's a disconnect between the big voices talking about the Epstein files and those little voices actually doing the legwork to look through the Epstein files. An influencer or politician finds one document and shouts about it on the internet only to look like an idiot because they didn't understand the overall context. Yes, Epstein's network did very bad things, but if we actually want to eventually make progress towards stopping the harm, we have to have some sort of structure, which is what I'm working on myself. I'm just warning everybody that over the next few weeks, the headlines are going to flash by in a blur, with everyone jumping from one conclusion to the next, without any weight added to the outrage. So far, there has been a severe underreaction on the Epstein case, simply because I think a lot of people either can't or don't want to understand the scale of it all. I mean, Epstein was a very bad dude, but I personally don't think he was the worst. I think there's far worse out there. I don't even think his network was the biggest. I think the reason he got rolled up is because a competitor got a hold of it and started to chip away at his own network. So it would be wise to operate off of the assumption that there are very big and bad fish out there that we have got to do something about. I mean, think about Epstein's network like a big Fortune 500 company, right? I mean, when Enron went under, all the dudes who worked for Enron at like the middle management to, lower levels, they went on to work for other companies, right? So the same thing happened with Epstein's network. Yeah, you may get the head of the snake, you may get Epstein and Maxwell and a few others at the very top, but the middle managers, the dudes who facilitated all this stuff, and the low people on the totem pole, all those people escaped and got away, along with all the big whales and the big fish out there that were the clients. So we've clearly got our work cut out for us, which is why you might see a lot of hesitancy to prevent the Epstein files from being released. I mean, they're not just trying to cover up past crimes, they're trying to cover up current operations. At least that's my own opinion, and right now, opinions don't matter a whole lot in a court of law, so we've got to be able to prove a lot of this stuff with data. Like, we all know what was happening with the Epstein network. We all know who was running it, we all know who was behind it. Okay, maybe not all of us, but some of us know. But in terms of actually getting some traction and shutting these networks down, we've got to have a lot more data. We've got to have a lot more to go off of. We have to have an overwhelming burden of evidence here. And that's going to take a lot more than just some guy with a comically large microphone on a podcast yapping about it. It is very clear that Epstein did not traffic people to nobody. He trafficked people to somebody. And those somebodies met those kids at a geographic point on Earth. And that, dear friends, I can plot on a map. Knowledge is half the battle, and we don't just need to know names, but we also need to know places. Again, knowledge is half the battle, and I don't want to be too biased here. I know this is quite self-serving because I work on a lot of map stuff, but the reason I do that is because I really do think it helps to visualize where these things are taking place. But anyway, enough about Epstein. More information is going to come in time. The goal right now is to add some method to the madness and not get caught up in the whirlwind of gotcha journalism on this sort of thing. These people aren't going anywhere. They are quite proud and very smug with the fact that they got away with it. They don't really care that their names are in the files, right? Well, we'll see about that in due time, but for now, a lot of long nights crunching numbers are ahead, and that's what I'm going to work on at the moment as safely as I can. Moving down to the southwest for this week, I wanted to briefly touch on what happened in El Paso a few days ago, because this was kind of an interesting item of note that came about a few days ago, which has brought about a lot of rumor and speculation regarding what in the Sam Hill actually happened. And here's what we know so far. Just before midnight on February 10th, a series of 2 airspace closures went into effect in El Paso, one of which was centered on the El Paso airport and grounded all of the aircraft at the airport for some time. This, of course, freaked a lot of people out because shutting down one of the most heavily trafficked airports in the United States for 10 days is not something that is done lightly or on a whim. The complete lack of notice whatsoever also adds to the seriousness of this event. When the NOTAM dropped, routine flight operations were being carried out, and there were even aircraft on the taxiways preparing to take off, with the air traffic control personnel being just as confused as everybody else when the airspace closure went into effect. For about 7 hours or so, rumors were the only things flying during the ground stop, and speculation still abounds regarding what this was all about. After a few hours, shortly before sunrise, White House officials stated that this airspace closure was implemented due to cartel drones breaching U.S. airspace and presenting a threat to aircraft in El Paso. But beyond this vague explanation, not much else is known with reasonable certainty. It's certainly possible that this is the truth. However, cartel drones have come over the U.S. border like daily for the past, 10 years or so. However, if this was a cartel drone or a swarm of cartel drones trying to smuggle drugs over the border or cause some kind of mayhem at the airport, which is kind of a long way from the border, but anyway, if that's what it was, then clearly it's something that was different from the nightly drone flights that are usually picked up every single day along the border. So clearly it was an anomaly of some kind, and I very highly doubt we'll ever know what it is. Now, once daylight broke and everybody was trying to figure out what had actually happened that night, Another potential theory came out, which I'll mention, even though it's completely unsubstantiated rumor, but I'll mention it just in the context of wider situational awareness. So some politicians and other officials which have leaked this to the media, they've made the claim that nothing actually happened the other night, but this was actually the result of a personal vendetta by FAA Director Brian Bedford, who was upset that the U.S. military was testing a laser-based directed energy weapon for shooting down drones at Fort Bliss last week. And they were doing that without telling the FAA about it. All of this is kind of coming out now. It wasn't really talked about that much in the media when it actually happened, but last week the U.S. Army they shot down what they thought was a drone. Turned out to actually be a party balloon from Fort Bliss, and when they did it, they didn't actually tell the FAA about it. So again, this is all rumor, but this would explain what might have happened. The FAA personally intervened to drop a NOTAM on top of El Paso solely to piss everybody off and hold the El Paso airport hostage, and thereby drawing attention to his personal gripe about coordinating with the military. Anybody who's ever worked in government knows that this is a possibility. After last week's laser weapon use, the FAA probably made the passive-aggressive decision to drop a blanket NOTAM on El Paso the next time a drone was spotted, which took place a couple of nights ago. So if this is what happened, it would be the most embarrassing yet least surprising outcome. But again, this possibility is solely based on the whispers of journalists and not any real concrete data, so there are probably many details that are false. Another theory which has gotten some level of traction on the internet, especially amongst the quieter communities out there, is that this was actually not really a drone, but maybe something else. El Paso specifically has been ground zero for a lot of new and developing cartel tactics and activity, due to Juarez being a major port of entry. And El Paso was at the center of the concerns of smuggled man pads 2 years ago, a case which faded into obscurity with nothing more than assurances being made via the telephone game of, well, I just heard that got resolved, which is why a lot of people are theorizing that this was about man pads instead of drones. For the record, I don't think this was about man pads. I think if it was, the NOTAMs would have been a lot larger, I think. Plus, there are a few other things I would have expected to have seen. I know a lot of people are bringing up this man-pad theory because the format of the NOTAM made many people think, myself included, that the NOTAM was trigger-based. As in, something got detected on some mystical system the US government has, and this NOTAM was either issued automatically without a human involved in the process, or somebody hit that big red button on the wall to shut everything down while they were figuring out what was going on. This part of the theory is quite accurate, I think. The format of the text in the NOTAM was non-standard and very quickly typed out. None of the usual national security airspace verbiage was put in there. It was basically just a hand-typed very short notice. The fact that this notice did not have any deconfliction information, no frequencies to contact, or any exceptions for medical aircraft is a strong indicator that this was a custom NOTAM built for something, and was probably triggered upon a certain event happening. Now, was this event a handful of cartel drones, or a man-pad, or was it just a personality spat between Fort Bliss and the FAA? That I don't know, and I don't think the public will ever know with any certainty, so something to keep an eye on, especially since the other NOTAM, the trapezoid-shaped one to the west of the city, that one's still active, and it's going to be active for a while, so most certainly something to keep an eye on, especially as the situation around the country gets hot and stays hot. So that pretty much wraps us up for this week. I've run out of time today. I wanted to talk about more, but you guys know how it is. I've been troubleshooting a lot of things that I've been working on over the past couple of weeks, and there are just not enough hours in the day anymore to do all the things I want to do, but that's okay. Some weeks are like that. I know the past couple of weeks have been a random assortment of world events, but that's the way it goes sometimes. So wrapping things up with the GhostNet reports for this week, it was a good net all around. This week I switched up things and chose a web SDR located out in the middle of the country to try to pick up different stations exchanging information on the airwaves this week. And I got a few here and there, but not as many as I usually get on the East Coast. So that's just the way that it works sometimes. Some of the more remote areas of the U.S. have web SDRs, and not a whole lot of people live there, so you're not going to get a whole lot of messages. The range on HF radio is always farther than you think, but it's never far enough, is it? So sometimes that kind of gets in the way of things, especially if you're out in the middle of nowhere, like middle of the Dakotas or something like that, trying to get on HF radio. You might need to choose a different frequency and different antenna arrangement. But all in all, the work continues on, and boy, do we have a lot of work ahead. So let's get after it and do the best that we can. So that's all I have for today. Thank you again, everyone, for sticking around, and we'll see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.